Hello everyone, this is Troy Eckard with Eckard Land and Acquisition in Allen, Texas. Today I have with me my son, Trevor Eckard, who's the engineer and director of operations for the company. One of the things we try to do in our updates and all of our video and education is we try to address some of the questions that partners have, but more importantly is we try to bring you up to date with things that are going on inside the industry. Now Trevor has had a long career involved in horizontal drilling and the completion of horizontal wells. He worked for a major public company for about 4 years before joining Eckard. One of the reasons we hired Trevor is because of his expertise when it comes to completions, well analysis, and really understanding the difference in results from wells based on frac technology, frac methodology, and really getting his head around how these wells perform over a long period of time. Now, I wanted to have some questions asked with Trevor that I think might provide some answers to some of our partners, but also just for a good basis of information. So I'm going to ask Trevor some questions. We're just going to have a dialogue. Hope you guys enjoy the conversation. So Trev, when you look at our model, our financial model, and you look at the industry as a whole when it comes to completions, we have a very conservative expectation in the financial model that wells drilled and completed today are going to be that much better than wells that were drilled 2, 3, 4 years ago. First question is, do you think we are too conservative in our financial model about how the wells will perform better, or do you think that's a fair way to do it by having a very modified performance for the new wells being drilled with today's technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously as Eckard, we're trying to be conservative as possible. You know, under promise, over deliver is kind of the motto. So I do think we could be more aggressive in terms of modeling our production, because we are basing a lot of these existing production and our existing forecast on these vintage wells that were completed prior to 2016. And we've talked about over and over that these newer completions are coming on. They're better wells because, one, more sand production equals more sand pumped into formation, more conductivity equals more flow, equates to more revenue. So they're pumping more sand, pumping more water, they're adding more holes in the pipe, which means more conduits of flow to the pipe, or to the wellbore, and ultimately to surface. And so ultimately these additions and these advancements in technology have really enhanced this oil production, and that's what's equating to these higher ROIs for these operators. And as a mineral owner, that's great.
Do you find that the sand was one of the key components by just adding more sand because it kept the reservoir open as a prop, or was it a combination of the number of perforations and openings in addition to the sand?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a bunch. You know, they have better technology, better drilling. First off, they're in zone more, which is huge for massive. You know, something like the Anadarko. You know, most shale plays are maybe a little less faulted than the Anadarko, and that's why we have George Gruno on board, because he allows us to look at these faults and make sure that operators are going to have what's their risk tolerance. But to answer your question, I think the biggest thing is sand and oil, or sand and water being pumped in the ground, bigger SRV, stimulated reservoir volume, meaning they're reaching out farther, they're having higher conductivity between those fractures. But on top of that, I think one of the biggest things that maybe we don't mention as much is these stages. So how long they're perforating these stages before they frack are more condensed, more holes, smaller spacing, and like I've mentioned earlier, it's just more ability for that reservoir to flow into that wellbore. There's no restriction in terms of holes, entry points into this wellbore.
So if I just put my novice brain around what you said, they have a 2-mile lateral. Before they might have had 15 stages, 15 isolated sections along that 2-mile lateral. They punch holes, they pump in sand, and they would get a flow back. Now they said, look, if we can reduce that to 50 or 100-foot intervals, and maybe we have 40, 50, 60 stages, we can concentrate the injection of sand and water, we can clean them out. The reservoir has more holes, it has more fractures, more exposure. So we're getting more because we are surgically being more specific on those stages, those completions, and those pressures, right?
Yeah, I think it used to be, frac stages is 300 every 300 foot, so you're getting a perforation. There's 5 perfs maybe per stage. You're getting every 50 to 100 foot a hole, which is a cluster of 3 1/8, 3.125 inches. That's how small it is. And what they did is they condensed it, and so instead of having a hole every 100 foot, 200 foot, it's every 15 to 50 foot.
Okay.
And that's just, more holes equals more flow.
But I do like the part you brought up, because I think that's where I also feel is that we call it the landing zone, the ability to take that drill bit and stay within that formation.
Yeah.
The more we stay in the formation, or the operator stays in the formation, the better results we're going to get from the fracking and the stimulation, right? So let me ask you this. So one of the advantages we've seen in the last 2 years is that prices have been a lot lower as far as drilling, completion, and fracking because the industry collapsed. Do you think the current rising price, the inflation as far as labor, cost, equipment, et cetera, how's that going to affect future drilling? You work for a major oil company. When prices go up, do you drill less wells, or does your cash flow make up for that? What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, it's always a balancing act. So I do think prices are obviously going up. You got higher steel prices, higher sand prices, higher labor prices. Just across the board, you're having higher prices. And you looked at the Dallas Fed survey that they had. They kind of introduce that every quarter, and it's these operators taking a survey, and every single one of them. I think there was one company out of 57 or something like that said that there wasn't an increase in prices coming. So everyone knows the prices are coming. Obviously the commodity price helps outweigh that because it's a balancing act in terms of how much money you spend versus how much money coming in, and commodities are a huge driver for that. But I think obviously it will affect it maybe slightly just because you're looking at your capital budget, and maybe instead of drilling 50 wells, you're drilling 48 or 47 wells. It's just kind of a balancing act, and you may see some of these operators in which we're seeing they're maybe reducing their position in non-operated aspects. So say they want to spend less on a well that they have a non-op position with. Maybe Ovenda doesn't want to be in Continental's well, and they may offload some of that to increase their own capital budget in wells that they have higher royalty, higher working interest in. So, yeah.
Do we have to have really a lot of concerns that some of these major operators will poor boy it or cut corners on their wells, or will they drill less wells? But the 48 they drill, they'll still do the very best fracking, or do we think they'll still drill 50, but they'll just cut back on sand and stages? I mean, what's the general trend? Everybody has their own choice.
Yeah, you may see some smaller operators, commodity prices, go down or whatever. They may try and cut corners, and the main thing would probably be just your drilling costs. Your drilling costs. It's really hard to avoid that, but you may see adjustments on completion side. But I think the operators that we're underneath and across that we're targeting across multiple basins, these are the best operators. They're the top operators. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on research development and development of this area. They're not going to go in and poor boy it because they need the returns as well. So
yeah, and I think that's the key thing that I think about is that a Continental, a Marathon, Ovenda, they're not going to save $500,000 and lose $5 million worth of reserves. They're going to do the right thing. They would rather drill 48 good wells than 50 mediocre wells. I think that's my conclusion. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. They may pull back a little bit because sometimes your cost per your rate of return is a little bit off. If you pump 7,000 pounds of sand or something like that per lateral foot, that's an overspend. But it's just a balancing act in terms of what they think they can get out of these wells. So
all right, got the last couple of questions before we wrap it up. One is my own personal question, which is decline curve. So it looks to me like wells coming on today are double, triple higher volumes than what I saw even 2 years. I mean, just off the chart, unbelievable wells, right? Is that going to affect the decline curve, or we're still starting with the same potential decline curve? We're just starting at a higher number, or do you think the decline curves will be less because we're adding more perf, adding more sand and more proppant? I mean,
I think the biggest thing with your EUR is how much conductivity do you have in your reservoir, and so the more sand you pump, the more fluid you pump, the farther you reach, the more because these shales are practically you cannot flow in them. You can talk about how limited flow they have, but that sand props up those fractures, and so the more sand you pump, the more conductivity you have, and ultimately, these wells are coming on higher. That's contributed to more holes, more sand, early time. But I think you're going to see it on the long term, and you are starting to see it. Is these wells may come down, kind of steep like the older wells, but they're leveling off slightly higher, and they're forecasting higher EURs because it's a more conductive, better stimulation of that reservoir.
Yeah, that's a good point. And for the audience, EUR is estimated ultimate recovery. And so what it really boils down to is, and what I interpret what Trevor said is, they're putting more sand, which is keeping the artificial fractures we're making open, wider, longer, bigger extent, which means a radial area of drainage is contributing to higher initial volumes and probably overall a higher aggregate of oil and gas reserves per well drilled. I think that's a fair way. And the last thing, do you think that wells that are being drilled today, let's say we always buy vintage wells, and so we have an existing mineral position, we know there's a producing well, we know the operator's going to drill 2 or 3 offsets. Tell me what your experience has been about operators' decisions to shut wells in temporarily while they stimulate new wells, and why do they do that? Because I think that's something we're going to see over our minerals over the next couple of years, where we might have a gap of 30 or 60 days where wells are down, but tell me why they do it.
Yeah, so it's all part of the development plan. So what you may see is, each section is a square mile. And so what they may be doing is coming in and drilling infill wells across 6 sections, meaning 6 square miles, and they'll go drill 3 wells per section. And when they come in and frack this, the biggest thing that they've seen, and the whole industry has seen, is once you pump these large fluids and large fractures at very, very high pressures, this fluid reaches out until that wellbore and potentially has catastrophic failure on the casing point of the older wells. And so what they're doing is, what they do is they shut those wells in. So that shut in allows that pressure to build up in that formation, and that fluid wants to go to areas that have the least amount of pressure. And so when you're able to shut that well in and pressure it up, and sometimes they pump water down to pressure it up, but ultimately that just kind of draws away that fracture from that wellbore, and it's ultimately protecting that existing producer, because if they frack into it and hit it, it could have actually multiple failures across that casing, and then you lose that $8 to $10 million well. So when they come in and do these infill developments, you are going to see these vintage producers shut in for the entire time of the frack, and maybe even during the flowback. So that'll be 30 to 60 days. And so we've seen that a couple of times on these minor vintage wells, without especially like Ovintiv up in Kingfisher. They shut in a well, protect it during the frack, and then as soon as it's finished, they flow it back along with the the newer wells.
So we as mineral owners should be prepared to know that as these oil companies fully develop our minerals and fully develop our value, there'll be intermittent 20, 30, 60-day shut-ins, and what they're doing is protecting the existing wells from being damaged by the new wells. And they do it because the pressure differential between low pressure, high pressure, we don't want to be the weak link on that pad side or in that section.
Yeah, that old well is produced for years and years and years, so it's a pressure sink, it's pressure depletion. So that high pressure is going towards that, and so what they do is they pressure it up as much as they can, protect the wellbore, which is good for mineral owners because you get to protect that wellbore. And I think, you're going to see that.
Well, once again, that's why we invest with only minerals under major oil companies, because they're smart enough to figure that out.
And they'll spend the effort to do it. So.
Yeah, they'll spend the money. Well, first off, thank you, Trevor. I always love having conversations with my son. He's always a very great information source with all the latest engineering, and he spends all of his time looking at our wells and our completions and industry data, and that is how we do part of our acquisition process. I'm Troy Eckard. I'm the CEO of Eckard Land and Acquisition. This is Trevor Eckard, Director of Operations, and our petroleum engineer on staff. And together, along with our acquisition team, these are the items and some of the details we're working on behind the scenes that you never see. But it's the amount of detail and the specific nuances of every one of these aspects we're looking at on a day-to-day basis that helps guide us in our decision of what we buy, where we buy, and who we invest underneath with the minerals that we acquire. Thank you very much for your time. We hope you appreciate the information.